The very, very rich are getting incredibly richer. The middle class is disappearing, and the poor are getting poorer. That is the tragic reality of our economy today.
Is that really true? Are rich people taking all the money, leaving the rest of us to starve? Is the American dream dead? Hi everyone, this is Ken Simpson of crystalbull.com and dynamicsofwealth.com. We want to do something a little different in this video. We do our best to stay out of politics, to just focus on economics. But sometimes politics is about economics. In this election cycle, you're going to be hearing a lot about income inequality and wealth inequality. Most of what you'll hear is false, or at least a misrepresentation of reality. Every political tribe bonds against a common bogeyman or enemy, and one side is trying to make the 1% our enemy. But before we let people bring out the pitchforks, we'd better make sure we have a clearer view of what's actually happening. So sit back, relax, and let us try to present a fresh look at income and wealth inequality. We've got some free tools to show you so you can inspect the data yourselves, and we're not going to pull any punches here. Sometimes the way political parties misuse the data to sow division amongst us is infuriating. You don't have to be a right-wing wacko to stand against this new brand of Marxism. Hopefully I can paint a clearer picture here. So let's get started.
The 90% of America, everybody not in that top 10%, how much of all that new income growth did they get? Answer, 0. 100% of it goes to the top 10%.
Okay, so where is this coming from? A lot of these statements about the statistics of income inequality come from this book. It's called Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. He fills 700 pages with charts and data trying to show that the rich are getting richer and that this is going to snowball into some evil oligarchy. Here is the chart from his book, which is the basis for much of the income inequality outrage. It plots income inequality over the last 100 years as a share of income for the top 10%. The narrative goes something like this. In 1980, the rich started getting richer and the poor poorer, so that income inequality has reached levels not seen since the days of the Great Gatsby. Many paint a picture of the period between the start of the World War II and the end of the Vietnam War as the good old days. You know, those times when we sent almost all of our most productive young men and women off to fight on foreign soil? Take a look at the numbers on the left of productive men and women enlisted in the war effort. It corresponds perfectly with the fall of income inequality as opportunities vanished. According to the Income Inequality Brigade, the good old days lasted until 1981, when Ronald Reagan and his failed trickle-down economics destroyed the middle class. You'll see charts like this one on the left from Mother Jones. It plots household income over time for various income groups. Here, the author says, the super rich have grabbed the bulk of the past 3 decades' gains. This is really duplicitous, and we'll show you why. We're going to do our best to offer a deeper insight into what is happening and a deeper dive into the data. There are many problems with this narrative and the conclusions made by many of our politicians and economists. Let's go through these one at a time to see why their conclusions may be distorted by their political biases. See how many of these logical fallacies and cognitive biases you can spot as the income inequality players come onto the stage. Let's start here. Finding truth. Watch for chart crimes. Back to this chart. First, notice the chart on the left. Its left axis is shown in dollars, which misleads the reader into inferring that the top 1% have had increasing incomes, while the incomes for those at the bottom have been flat. Charts like these should be shown in percentage change, not dollars. In dollars, if everyone had the same percentage change gains over the years, those at the top would show an upward slope, as you see, while it would be very hard to see the slope for those at the bottom. To demonstrate what we mean, imagine that everyone's incomes tripled over this period. Those at the top would go from $500,000 to $1.5 million with a steep slope. That's 3x. Those at the bottom would triple from $20,000 to $60,000. That's also 3x. The slope would be about the thickness of the lines in this chart, barely detectable. Every group's income increased by similar percentages, but here, this chart dupes its readers showing misleading slopes. That's a chart crime. The second chart crime is that they use average income. Remember, the lowest quintile here has a lower bound at 0 and an upper bound of the next quintile, so they're going to stay within a very small range of 0. Upper incomes are unbound. Some very large incomes pull the average up. Think of it this way. If Bill Gates walked into one of my dinner parties, the average wealth in the room would make it seem that everyone were a billionaire. But using the median, each person would still be solidly middle class. Using median income presents reality. Using average income distorts reality to paint a false image. So beware of charts like these that shows changes in dollars and average incomes. You want to look for charts that use percentage change on the left axis so you can properly compare relative changes and median incomes. Also, notice that most of these charts use income before taxes. After-tax data are hard to get. Changes in taxes and transfer payments have redistributed much of the income disparity away. More on that in a minute. And it doesn't help the data scientists at the Federal Reserve commit the same chart crimes. The left-hand chart shows dollars on the left axis and mean or average income. Notice the huge gap and that misleading increase in slope as incomes increase. Pretty hard to see the increase in the lower income brackets. The right-hand chart still shows dollars on the left axis, which as we know distorts the slope of change for those different brackets, but at least it shows median income, properly showing a tighter income gap. Getting closer. Here's one from NPR's Planet Money. 40 years of income inequality in America in graphs. I'm a fan of Planet Money. They have a terrific podcast, but here they've committed a common chart crime, charting income percentiles in dollars, which again exaggerates the slope as we move up the chart. Without this exaggeration, the increasing income inequality problem they're alluding to pretty much vanishes. When they published this story, they said, "The graph reveals a striking pattern. After adjusting for inflation, income was basically flat for households in the bottom half of the economic ladder. Right around the middle, income starts to pick up, and the higher you go up the income ladder, the more income growth you see." They were fooled by their own chart crime. At least they came back to correct another misconception, stating, "Update, many households move up and down the economic ladder over time," which we will address here shortly. But while we're here, let's address another chart crime. Back to the Mother Jones charts. The chart on the right plots a change in the share of income for each group over time. Here the author commits another chart crime. This chart implies that lower incomes have been falling. In fact, incomes have not been falling. The change in share of income is due to a dramatic rise in top incomes, not a fall in income for the lower brackets. Lower income brackets have remained relatively steady, and we'll show you that in a minute. You'll see this type of chart crime committed rather frequently. The author may instead use a pie chart to imply the same thing, showing the readers that the slice for the top income group has gotten larger, forcing the lower group slices smaller. What they neglect to show is that the whole pie got larger, and no group slice shrunk. Let me repeat, incomes for those in the lower brackets have not been falling. Showing a change in share of income is just a way of fomenting anger and jealousy, which is truly an ugly cause, but seems to sell subscriptions. And while we're on the subject of statistics, crimes, and bad inferences,
are we satisfied that in America today, the three wealthiest people in this country, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, now own more wealth than the bottom half of America, that is 160 million people?
oh, Bernie, you crazy socialist. What a miscarriage of data justice. You yourself have more wealth than the bottom 50%. Let's take a look. Here we're talking about wealth, not income, but this idiocy has to be addressed. If we zoom in on the lower levels of family wealth, we see that there are a lot of families with negative net worths. These are not the poor and the destitute. These are families who have been living beyond their means and taking on lots of debt. We all know families like this. They may have big houses, fancy cars, boats, and kids in private schools, but they've buried themselves keeping up with the Joneses. These are not homeless people. Most homeless people have zero debt. A homeless person's net worth may just be the value of their belongings, but it is greater than zero. As we move along the chart, adding up the cumulative net worth of Americans in the lower brackets, the negative net worths, shown in red, counter the low positive net worths, shown in green. Not until you get closer to the 50th percentile do you get to a net zero of cumulative net worth. This means that the sum total of the bottom 50% of Americans' net worth is zero. A homeless person has a higher net worth than the bottom 50% combined. Bernie Sanders' net worth has been estimated at about $2 million. That puts him here on the chart. Kamala Harris falls here. At what point will Americans stop listening to this nonsense? Victimhood sells. But let's get back to correcting the income inequality myths and what the Planet Money article noted. Truth number one, These are not the same people in the income groups throughout the years. Back to this chart. When Mother Jones says winners take all and the super rich have grabbed all the gains, they are implying that some evil rich people are taking all the money, leaving everyone else to starve. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders repeat these lines at every campaign stop. They act as if some evil tyrant like this guy is taking all the money. This is exactly how Marxists build resentment against the successful. The bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat. Isn't that what they are implying with this chart? But remember, the same people are not in the same income categories now as they were in 1980. To demonstrate, let's pull up an income distribution chart from dynamicsofwealth.com. It shows the percentile of households at each income level. Ignore those spikes coming out of the top of the distribution. Those are simply from people rounding off their incomes to 60, 70, 80,000 or 65, 75, 85,000 in the survey. The distribution is exactly what should be expected. Ignore the Gini coefficient chart at the top right as well. We'll explain that in a second. But what do we mean when we say, these aren't the same people over the years? Well, 1980 was 40 years ago. Jeff Bezos was 16 years old in 1980, and most likely at the lower end of this income distribution. Sergey Brin and Larry Page of Google were 7 years old. Mark Zuckerberg wasn't even born yet. The doctors, lawyers, engineers, stockbrokers, and other professionals who were at their peak earning years in 1980 are mostly either retired or dead today. The world is a much different place. Much opportunity has been created. A few years ago, the Washington Post ran an article reviewing 2 books by left-wing authors, tying income inequality to the betrayal of the American dream. Let's talk about the American dream for a minute. And if you forgot what the American dream is, ask an immigrant. The American dream has always been about freedom and creating better lives for yourself and your family. Entrepreneurship and owning a business has always been a big part of that. Let's look at the life cycle of a typical entrepreneur and how they have great mobility between the income brackets. As anyone who has started a business can tell you, it takes a lot of risk, hours, hard work for the first few years. Blood, sweat, toil, stress, fear, and risk. And most small companies fail in the first few years. During this time, the entrepreneurs typically make very little money as they grow their businesses. If they enjoy some success, they'll start moving up the income ladder. After a few years and much hard work and red tape, they may start making some real money. The very best will enjoy great success and move into the top 10%, maybe even higher. At some point, they may receive offers from investors, or may just decide to sell their company. Perhaps they just want to retire. Some may get a 6 or 7 figure windfall from the sale of their company, moving into the top 1/10 of 1%, or the top 1/100th of 1%, or even higher. That is income mobility. Well, what happens to their income after they sell their company? The annual income from their business is gone. They may start a new company, again with very little initial income. They may live off the returns from investing the proceeds of their company sale. Regardless, they will most likely move back into the middle-class income range. Cycles like this happen all the time. Over the years, most people move from entry-level to supervisory jobs, from supervisory to executive, from executive to investor class. It happens all the time and a big part of the American dream. Just who are these people in the top 1% of income earners? Here is another chart from Mother Jones. It lists executives, managers, supervisors, doctors and nurses, bankers, lawyers, engineers. I'm trying to find the evil capitalists in this group. There is no monopoly man nor Dickensville enlisted. Here's a chart from the American Enterprise Institute. According to this study, 56% of Americans will spend at least 1 year in the top 10%. Let me repeat, a majority of Americans will spend at least 1 year in the top 10%. 12% will spend at least a year in the top 1%. Imagine that, 12% of Americans will spend at least a year in the top 1%, while only 0.6% will do so for 10 consecutive years. That is not oligarchy. That is the definition of income mobility, and why we say truth number 1, these are not the same people in the income groups throughout the years. What else is going on here? Instead of saying, the American dream is dead, they should be saying, wow, opportunities to move up the income ladder have never been greater. Moving on. Here is Mayor Pete Buttigieg, certainly the smartest and most impressive of the progressives running for president in 2020.
Experts told us that we could make our society and our economy dramatically more productive and that everybody would be better off. And what happened was that we made our society and our economy dramatically more productive, and most people stayed right where they were. Since 1973, the tide has risen just about more than any tide has ever risen. And most of the boats stayed right where they were. So you can see why there's a certain amount of disaffection with the kinds of things that Democratic and Republican experts have preached, especially during the era that I think is coming to an end, but the era that you might describe as the Reagan consensus of neoliberal economics has pretty much dominated the way Democratic and Republican presidents have behaved in my entire lifetime. So I think that has contributed to a sense of frustration that in some cases expresses itself with a vote to burn the house down.
You watch that change at 1980. What happened in 1980? Ronald Reagan gets elected. We move to trickle-down economics, cut taxes for those at the top, and start cutting back on investments in opportunities.
Do you think that perhaps these people's politics, their biases, are distorting their analysis? Could there have been anything else that happened around 1980 to change productivity and opportunity? Back to this chart from Piketty. First of all, Reagan didn't take office until 1981, after the uptrend in this chart had already started. His first tax cut was phased in over 3 years, so really wouldn't have been felt until about 1984. His major tax reform, the Tax Reform Act of 1986, didn't take effect until 1987. 1987 was a big down year in this chart, and subsequent years were flat. What's more, Clinton took office in 1993, undoing some of Reagan's policies, but the uptrend continued. The data do not support this narrative. Could there have been any other reason, starting in the late 70s, where opportunities and wealth expanded? This brings us to truth number 2. Opportunities have grown exponentially. Consider this chart, showing the number of computers connected to the internet since it was created. Have opportunities changed since 1980? Have entrepreneurs been able to expand their markets from Main Street to around the globe? This chart is in logarithmic scale. On a normal arithmetic scale, that line would be nearly vertical. What it shows is that we've reached 1 billion internet connections on a planet of 7 billion people. Yes, opportunities and markets have greatly expanded. This is what exponential growth in market opportunity looks like. The telephone was brought to market in 1878. It took 75 years for the telephone to reach 100 million users. Cell phones, 16 years. Facebook, 4.5 years. Candy Crush, 15 months. The next big things will hit 1 billion users within a year. This is what progress looks like, and opportunities for tremendous wealth creation. The innovation curve is going vertical. In the near future, we will have self-driving electric cars, cleaner energy, in-phone medical diagnostics, 30-minute delivery of goods, medical cures, virtual travel, civilian space tours, and things we have not yet dreamed about. The year 2000 is finally here. We now have video calls on our watches, and soon we'll have flying cars. Let's overlay that chart of internet connections over the Piketty chart. Do you think this fits the curve better than the neo-Marxist Reagan failed trickle-down economics narrative? Throughout the 1987 stock market crash, the oil Federal Reserve Bush 41 tax hike recession, the dot-com bubble, and the housing bubble, and it's almost a perfect fit. 1977 brought us the Apple II computer, along with Tandy TRS-80 and Commodore 64. IBM PC came along in 1981, Windows 1983, Macintosh in 1984. Mosaic, which became Netscape, the first internet browser, came in 1993. Internet Explorer came in 1995. Which do you think had a greater effect on opportunities to create wealth, the internet or Reagan's tax cuts?
And to take on these billionaires who are doing so much harm to our country and our political life.
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
Now on to another data crime. Those who use disparate incomes to sow resentment for political gain usually use household income statistics. Does household income alone tell the tale of unfairness that they are implying? No. Let me explain. Household income is a fraction. It's income per household. As a fraction, changes in the numerator move the value of the fraction linearly. This is what we're used to seeing intuitively. But changes in the denominator change the value hyperbolically. Changes in households in the denominator may be far more powerful than changes in incomes. The income inequality propagandists never talk about changes to households since 1980, but we will. Which brings us to truth number 3. Households have changed. We're going to show you some free tools you can use to visualize household changes in a moment. First, let's look at some of the charts from the Federal Reserve showing some of the structural changes to households that may have affected household income data. First, here's median income by work status of head of household. Notice the left axis is in dollars, distorting the slopes of those lines. If anything, this shows that the non-working and retired have had their incomes grow more than the working class over the last decades. But it shows the obvious, that working people earn more than retired or non-working. Have we had an increase in retirees or the unemployed since 1980? We'll see in a minute. The next chart shows income by race. Black and Hispanic households have been earning less than white households, but look at the slopes of those bottom two lines. Family incomes have been growing steadily for Black and Hispanic families. The gap is narrowing. That's great news. But Black and Hispanic households still make less than white households. Has the percentage of Black and/or Hispanic households changed over the last 4 decades? Here's a chart showing income by education level. There's a huge disparity between college-educated households and those who did not finish high school. Has the percentage of either of those categories changed? Shown here is family income versus the net worth of each family. As expected, high net worth families may have investment income in addition to their earnings. Once a family earns enough to cover necessities like food, shelter, clothing, cars, and even their cable TV package, they should have excess funds to invest. We'll cover those effects in the tools to follow. Or how about the disparity between couples and single parents? This is one of the largest disparities you'll find. Of course, 2-earner households earn more than single-earner households. Has the number of single-person households changed? We'll see that in our data tools. Yes, the makeup of households has changed, a very important point when analyzing income per household. Think of it this way. It's not every day that a couple doubles their income overnight, but a divorce cuts their household income in half. A marriage doubles their household income. We don't hear the progressives talk about changes to the household. They imply it's all theft of income. That brings us to truth number 4. Nature of income has changed. Yes, the advent of the computer and the internet has greatly increased income opportunities for those who implemented these new tools. But how else has the nature of income changed in the last 40 years? Here we show 3 different measures of incomes adjusted for inflation in constant 1980 dollars. The green line is for wages and salaries of employees. The red line is for proprietor's income. A proprietor here is essentially a non-incorporated entrepreneur. The blue line is corporate profits. Notice that these 3 lines track nearly the same path for decades. In the early 90s, a diversion occurred. What happened here? Reagan's destruction of labor unions? Sorry, comrades. Reagan left office in 1989, and Clinton came in 1993. We've already talked about how the internet created opportunities for tremendous wealth creation, but look at what also happened on a smaller, more granular level. Computers allowed entrepreneurs to thrive, and the number of entrepreneurs skyrocketed. A person working from home could soon reach a market of millions of people. eBay came along in 1995, and entrepreneurs were off to the races. How else did the nature of income change over the last 40 years? We all know that the baby boomers have been retiring in droves, and we'll show that in our interactive tool in a minute. Social Security, disability, welfare, and other assistance programs are categorized as transfer payments by the government, and we'll show you how those have increased. But there are also wages in kind that are often overlooked. Here's a chart from the Kaiser Family Foundation, tracking employer-paid health care benefits, which are not included in most income statistics. The same goes for employer-paid retirement plan benefits. Both have increased, but are ignored by the class baiters. This chart shows a $10,000 increase in salary in kind for workers just since 1999. Remember this when you hear people talk about how wages or hourly incomes have been flat. Total income, including wages and benefits, are what are important here, not W-2 wages. And real total incomes have been increasing the quality of life for millions. Here are another 2 charts from Wikipedia, citing the Congressional Budget Office's Household Income Report. The chart on the left is typical of what the alarmists choose to show. It shows household income, but ignores transfer payments and taxes. At least it shows that all incomes have actually grown, in real terms, counter to what we're being fed. The right chart accounts for changes in taxes and transfer payments. Notice the difference? The gaps narrow. And this shows that the lowest quintile has actually seen a much larger increase than the middle class. We are already redistributing income, which brings us to our next truth. Tax rates have changed since the 1970s. The propagandists will only show you the chart at the top left, showing share of pre-tax income over time. It satisfies their priors and biases and implies that the top 1% are running away with all the money. After accounting for taxes in the top right chart, you see the difference is not so dramatic. And this chart hasn't yet accounted for the changes in transfer payments to the bottom 50%, which would show the bottom 50% in a better trend. Remember, like the right-hand chart in that Mother Jones article, this shows share of income. It misleads the reader into thinking that incomes for the bottom 50% have been falling. They have not. The share has decreased not because people in this group's incomes have fallen, but because opportunities for those entering the top 10% have greatly expanded. So that gives us a pretty good outline for spotting the income inequality myths in the narrative. Now let's get to the fun part, where we share our new interactive tool that you can use to see the changes in household income and its components over time. Let's head on over to the Dynamics of Wealth Income Inequality Study. Here we have parameters we can change to watch the chart change through time. This is not adjusted for inflation. If we go back in years, you'll see the chart compress. And that's really not fair because a lot of the change in income has been due to inflation. So we're going to correct this for inflation. And we're going to click here. You can change it. You can use it in 1980 dollars using the CPI as a deflator or using PCE, personal consumption expenditures, as a deflator. And we're going to use that. And since we've compressed this, we're going to change the chart maximum, drag it down so we can really see what's going on here. Okay? I'm also going to click on here and highlight the middle class. The middle class here is defined as between the percentiles of 20 and 80. Basically, that's what people define for middle class. The red line you'll see is the median income level. Now, I'm going to go back all the way to 1980 here and watch the progression. Now, we don't have data between 1980 and 1990 or 1990 and 2000. We only have those census data. So we're going to skip from 80 to 90 to 2000 here. And I'm just going to mouse over and use the arrow key to go. But you'll see the median income there. It's right at $20,000 a year. Now we're going to skip to 1990. The median has gone up. Everybody has improved here. 1980, 1990. Notice that the distribution has shifted to the right in real terms. These are in 1980 dollars. Okay? Everybody got better. Let's go to the year 2000. Again, the distribution moved to the right. Okay, now we're going to go through 1 year at a time. Remember, 2000 was a recession, so we'll go 2001. Everybody got a little bit worse. 2002, back to about the same. 2003, and then things started to get a little better, but the median income started to barely move up here. Okay, just kind of dances around as we go through. Now, it's moving back to the left. 2008-9, remember the big recession, the Great Recession? So people's incomes went down here. 2012, 2013, 2014, 15, 16, and 17. Notice the distribution moving to the right. Contrary to what the politicians are telling you, the middle class did not get decimated here. Median incomes did not fall. Here we'll overlay the 1980 histogram over the 2017 histogram so you can get a direct comparison. Notice the distribution has shifted to the right. Every income group has improved. At the 20th percentile, which is considered the start of the middle class, the income shifted from $9,000 a year to $12,000 a year. That's a 33% improvement. The median income at the 50th percentile shifted from $20,000 to $28,000. That's a 40% improvement. The top end of the middle class at the 80th percentile shifted from $32,000 a year to $53,000 a year, a 66% improvement. All income groups have improved in real inflation-adjusted dollars, despite what the politicians are selling us. Now, let's watch the horizontal bars at the top of this chart change as we go through time. I'm going to go all the way back to 1980 here. Here's 1980 again. Let's just watch the number of families in the household as we go through the distribution, and I'm just going to click and drag this across. Let's look at the top bar as we go from 1980 through 2017. The number of single-family households doesn't really change much. Okay, you might have expected something different here, but that really hasn't affected household income much at all. Same for the number of subfamilies. Here in 1980, it's 95.2% with 0 subfamilies and 4.6% with 1 subfamily. Let's go through time. The number of subfamilies increases. Okay, The number of zero subfamilies goes from 95 down to 90. The number of subfamilies increases. That's something to consider here, the number of subfamilies in a household. Now let's look at the number of mothers in a household and the number of fathers in a household as we go through this. In 1980, there were 33.7% of households without the mother present, and there were 42.9% of households without the father present. Also look at those with the mother or the father. 61.7% had a mother and 55.8% had a father, at least one of each. Now let's go through the time. 1990, and we'll go through all the way up to 2017, and look what happens to the numbers. Okay, the number of households without a mother present jumped to 42.3%. The number of households without a father present jumped to 51.4%. Remember what we talked about with changes to the household and how that affects the fraction of income per household. Here we've seen a strong increase of single-parent households. That's not good, but that certainly does decrease the income per household, especially in the lower income brackets. So let's watch the income disposition here change as we go through the years. First, let's look at the transfer payments at the far right, the blue bar. In 1980, it was 11.25% of household income. Now let's go through the progression of years. As we go through, that starts to climb, okay? Up 12, 13, 14, 16, 17%. That's the year 2010. Remember all the unemployed and the disability payments that were going out? Transfer payments jumped to 17% of household income during that Great Recession. And now it's starting to come down a little bit, but with all the retirees, it's still 15.77%. That's a pretty good increase. That really changes the income per household, especially for those that are in the lower income brackets receiving transfer payments. Also, let's watch the red bar, proprietor income. Go back to 1980 here, and we'll go through the progression. In 1980, proprietor income was 6.89%. We talked about that. It rises up. It's up to 8%, down a little bit during the Great Recession, and then it starts to rise again. We're up to 8%. So proprietor income has increased. We talked about how household has changed and how the nature of income has changed, and that's one of the things. We've had a several percent increase in proprietor income. Now let's look at the progression for household age as we go through time. Especially pay attention to the last two bars, those people that are 65 years of age or older. And currently that's 12.52% plus about 8%. It's about 20.5%. That's 1980. Now watch what happens as we go through time. We know the baby boomers are starting to retire. Okay? And here they come. Boom, 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 boom. And here we are now. Now we've got over 25% of households have the head of household at retirement age or higher. Households have changed over this progression. That's important when you're measuring income per household. Let's take a look at the Gini coefficient here as we go through the time progression. Now, what is this Gini coefficient or Gini index? In part 2 of this video series, we will explain everything you need to know about the Gini coefficient in simple terms with example scenarios. Be sure to check that out. It's not difficult to understand, and you'll be the most knowledgeable person in the room after watching that video. For now, what you need to know is this. The Gini chart has two lines. These lines show the cumulative sum total of all the population's incomes as you add them up from the lowest incomes to the highest. Each time you tally a person, you add their income to the pool. The x-axis is the percent of population measured, and the y-axis is the percent of income added to the pool. The top line is the Marxist dystopia, where each person in the population has the same exact income. Each time you add a person, the total increases by the same amount, resulting in a straight line. Most of us know that such a society is unsustainable. Why? Because if everyone makes the same income, there is no incentive to produce. Why should a person work harder to produce a higher quantity or better quality product? The slouch sitting next to them makes the same income. This is why most communist or socialist economies devolve into brutal, tyrannical dictatorships. A dictator must use violence to force workers to produce, either in prison camps or brutal, slave-like factories. Because without the carrot, all you have is the stick. That top line, with perfect equality, is the goal for many, to get as close to that as possible. The bottom line is the tally of incomes in the actual sample. As you start sampling, those in the bottom income brackets add very little to the total. As you keep tallying, the total grows faster and faster, resulting in an upward curve. The area between the two curves is the Gini coefficient. With perfect equality, there is no area between curves and the Gini is zero. In a society where all people have zero income, except one person with an income, the Gini coefficient chart looks like this, and the Gini coefficient is 1, or 100 if shown as a percentage, as we do. Now let's see how the Gini coefficient progresses as we go through the years. Back to 1980, okay? 1980 shows a Gini coefficient of 36.9, but look at this bar on the far right. This survey capped everyone at $75,000 a year. So the Gini coefficient would be much higher than this as you took that bar and distributed it up to its actual income levels. So this is probably a Gini coefficient of close to 40, let's say. Okay, so let's go to 1990. We're up to 40.8, and we'll go through. We'll just watch the Gini coefficient up to 43, back down a little bit, 44. The Gini coefficient is climbing, 44, 45. We're up to 2011, and all the way up to today, 45.5. Hasn't changed a lot, but that's what has happened to the Gini coefficient. It's gone from about 40 to about 45.5 in the last 40 years. The main thing to know is that what increases the area under the curve, the Gini coefficient, is the number of people at the lower end of the income range and the number of dollars at the top end. We've already talked about the tremendous growth and opportunity that has led to greatly increased incomes at the upper end. But what keeps the number of households at the lower end high? We seem to have a continuous supply of households in the bottom 20%, even as income migration causes the distribution to move to the right for nearly everyone else. Well, as we just pointed out, the number of householders in retirement has increased, as has the number of single-parent households. Most households in these groups fall down in this range. What else could be keeping the stock of low-income households high? How about immigration? Hold it right there, Snowflake. Before you start casting aspersions, you should know that I'm generally pro-immigration. My father immigrated to this country when he was 15. I can trace immigrants on my mother's side back to the Mayflower. I'm only commenting on how high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants add to our income inequality and increase the Gini coefficient. We have plenty of low-skilled immigrants coming to our country to improve their lives, and they typically fall down in this low income range. So the higher the number of low-skilled immigrants, the higher the Gini coefficient is going to be. But it's not just the low-skilled immigrants that are keeping the Gini coefficient high. We also have a very high number of high-skilled immigrants coming into the country. Doctors, engineers, company founders. According to this article from Forbes, 43 of the Forbes 400 are first-generation immigrants. We just had another company go public, Zoom, with an immigrant founder. That makes it 44 of the Forbes 400 are first-generation immigrants. They're moving into the billionaire class, and that certainly keeps the Gini coefficient high. The Gini coefficient is making a comeback. It's taught in nearly every college's economics curriculum, and young economics majors understand what it is. Here's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a newly elected fireball in the Congress. After she won her primary, she tweeted, "I'm wondering how many of the House Democrats have a degree in economics like I do. Trying to find who out here is going to be in the Gini coefficient appreciation squad." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a minor in economics where she learned about the Gini coefficient and now is on a crusade to alter the outcomes of millions of transactions to redistribute income from the upper class to the lower class. When politicians decide that they can distribute the fruits of economic growth better than a market of free people can, they are essentially reversing countless Democratic votes. What do I mean by that? Yes, free market capitalism is the most democratic economic system ever to emerge. I didn't say ever to be created or designed because it was not created or designed. It evolved as free peoples developed trade amongst themselves and created currencies to tally the value of services and goods traded. Every purchase you make is a culmination of a series of countless votes in free, democratic fashion. For example, let's say you decide to purchase a new blender to make your favorite smoothie. When you go down to the mom and pop store to make the purchase, you cast countless votes for each component of the assembly and the labor and transportation costs to get it to your home. Down to the smallest screw, votes were cast to affirm the value of each part. When the manufacturer purchased that screw, they voted to affirm the value of the geologists who found the iron, carbon, nickel deposits, the miners who performed the labor to extract it, onto the excavators built to dig, the oil companies who created the oil and diesel, the machinists, the platers, a countless series of transactions. And don't forget the shareholders of each of the corporations involved. They risk their money to create the companies to bring you those goods. Then, move on to the glass jar, the plastic housing, the shipping materials, the printers, and the petroleum and transportation companies who move the raw materials and parts along the path to becoming the final product in the store. Also, you voted to pay mom and pop for the convenience of bringing all sorts of goods together in one location. And you voted to pay for a car, fuel, tires, insurance, maintenance to go get the blender and bring it home. They are all votes affirming the value of each input to produce that shiny new blender sitting on your counter. No government entity was needed to determine the fair value of a screw, or the engineer's time, or the copper miner who sent copper to the wire manufacturer. Millions of votes were cast to make sure everyone was treated fairly and were happy to make the transactions. A fair trade wizard could not have designed a better system. Now, let's say that, instead of driving down to mom and pop's, you decided to go to your computer to order from Amazon. You cast a few different votes. Instead of driving around town shopping for blenders, you voted to open your computer and read others' reviews. Instead of voting to drive to the store, you voted to substitute a portion of a trip on a UPS truck for the final few miles, reducing carbon emissions, car expenses, parking, and the like. You cast some votes for your internet provider, the fiber optics and networking companies, computer manufacturers. You get the idea. Also, you voted not to pay mom and pop for their rent, utilities, wages, insurance, advertising, shrinkage, etc., and to instead pay Jeff Bezos a couple of pennies for creating a system which brought the world these new efficiencies. When a redistributionist wants to increase taxes on a certain group of people, they are essentially telling us that we are not voting properly. They insist on taking most of the 2 pennies you voted to send Jeff Bezos and the Amazon shareholders and send it elsewhere. When they tell us that they want to implement a wealth tax, they are telling us that all those trillions of votes cast by free people were cast incorrectly. They insist on going back, retroactively, and revaluing the countless free decisions that were made along the way. They may decide that the woman who created the company which printed the user guides should never have been allowed to become wealthy. They will change the rules halfway through the game to take the fruits of that entrepreneur's labors and send them to others. What they don't realize is that markets are too complex to understand, and meddling almost always makes things worse. They think they're smart enough to fix the world and propose all kinds of ill-conceived ideas, bringing us many bad, unintended consequences. They're first-order, single-layer thinkers. Simpletons with hubris should not be allowed to meddle with markets.
No, fellow traveler, I'm not arguing against all taxes. I'm just saying that targeting the rich with high taxes because you don't like the way people voted with their dollars and don't think the market properly valued their contributions is a bad idea and not very democratic.
And that's why I say free market capitalism is the most democratic economic system ever to emerge.
This is what democracy should.
I hope you've gotten something out of this presentation. The idea is to counter the narrative that is telling us that the middle class is getting decimated here, the rich are running away with all the money, and that we need higher taxes and more welfare programs. Feel free to go to dynamicsofwealth.com and use these tools yourself to see how things have changed. And thank you for watching. I look forward to hearing your comments.
And I very much would appreciate your help in getting this video out to your friends and to your family.